Then let us come to our next agenda point, and the next two sessions will be moderated by Steve, my colleague from Bank of Ireland. Steve has an extensive experience in the audit world from the external perspective as well from the internal audit perspective. Steve, you worked for PwC, for Barclays, and you are now the head of the audit function of the Bank of Ireland UK. So, Steve, I hand over to you. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Andrea. And I was furiously taking notes there, obviously, as Evelyn was talking, in the interest of my PD, I think. So thank you, Evelyn, for the tips. Yes, it's a delight to be here, everyone. And it's a fantastic agenda. I'm relatively recent joining Andrea and the others on the banking committee for the ECIA, and now supporting Andrea as the vice chair there, which is my immense pleasure. I'm now the group chief internal auditor at the Bank of Ireland, having relinquished my role in the UK just a couple of years ago. And our next session, we are very delighted to have a fantastic speaker joining us, in India Springer. Welcome, India. It's great to have you on the session. And a topic which for a long time has been one obviously very close to our hearts, our interest, and is always there as a really important focus in anti-money laundering and CFT. And I don't know about yourselves out there, but I always think of this topic as the one that the moment you take your eye off it, or you relax your attention, it'll bite you, and it'll bite your organizations. And I certainly would have some personal experience in some of my organizations in the past that I've worked for, where we've had tough times. A lot of developments, of course, in this field. And India, you've got a very key role as an expert in this field at the EBA, and formerly at the Central Bank of Ireland. In fact, there's a bit of an Irish theme this morning so far. So you're very welcome here. Thank you for joining us. I know you've got some thoughts that you'd like to share with us, so I might hand to you to share your thoughts on this topic before we invite some questions, perhaps.
Excellent. Good morning, everyone. Can I just check that you can hear me well before we start?
Perfect. Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you very much, and thank you, Steve, for very nice introductory words. So today I will focus on the latest developments in the anti-money laundering and counter-terrorist financing area. I will speak a little bit about the EBA's role, what we do, and our latest regulatory instruments that we have published that might be relevant also for the internal auditors. And equally, I will briefly touch upon the latest developments at an EU level, because there's quite a lot happening in recent months and the next few years to come. So if we can progress to the next slide. So the developments have been happening for quite a while now. Obviously, we've seen the publication of the 4th and 5th directive that all aim to strengthen AML-CFT framework in the Europe. But equally, the amended version of the EBA regulation that brought in certain changes to how EBA operates and what is our role in relation to anti-money laundering and counter-terrorist financing. So up until January 2020, the EBA role was mainly policy development and a standard setter role, where we work together closely with our other ESAs, those being EIOPA and ESMA. So we worked together to develop various regulatory instruments. But since January 2020, our role has changed, and the 3 mandates from 3 ESAs have been now given to the EBA. And EBA's role is, of course, much wider now in the area of anti-money laundering and counter-terrorist financing. Particularly, we were given a specific legal mandate to lead, coordinate and monitor AML-CFT efforts across the EU, and to ensure that the EU financial sector is not abused for money laundering or terrorist financing purposes. So with that in mind, we have we have set out quite an ambitious work program where we have launched a number of different interesting projects, like some of those being the review of competent authorities' approaches to AML CFT supervision, equally carrying out various peer reviews and various investigations. So all that has come into our remit since January 2020. If we can progress to the next slide, please. So we have worked quite extensively over the past few years, and on this slide I've set out various different regulatory instruments that we have published over the probably 5 or 6 years. As you can see, there's quite a lot that we have done. So we have published 3 RTSs, so regulatory technical standards. We have also worked on 11 different guidelines, and with one of those, an additional 1 guideline is currently being worked on and will be published for public consultation later on this year. And we have also published 7 different opinions. So as you can see from this slide, that a lot of our work focuses specifically on anti-money laundering and counter-terrorist financing, but equally our focus has shifted slightly over the last few years, where we have identified various links between prudential and AML aspects like risks and supervision. So we have worked quite a lot to emphasize those links and to really highlight how money laundering and terrorist financing risks should also be considered for prudential risk assessment purposes. But today I won't be speaking, I won't have time to speak about all of these regulatory standards, but I will focus on 3 that might be specifically beneficial for internal auditors. And of course, one of those, the first one and the most important, would be the risk factor guidelines. They were originally published back in 2016, and now the amended version has been published on our website. These guidelines basically highlight the risk factors that financial institutions need to consider when they're putting in place their own risk assessment for money laundering and terrorist financing purposes. So basically, these guidelines highlight specific risk factors that may indicate an increased risk in a specific sector or potentially a reduced risk in a specific sector. And they also set out specific measures that financial institutions can take to reduce the risk that the specific sector or specific customer or product is exposed to. So with that in mind, obviously, these guidelines would be quite helpful for internal auditors to ensure that the risk-based approach that is required within the AML framework is implemented by financial institutions effectively. And I suppose they also help to ensure that adequate systems are put in place to mitigate the risk that is identified effectively. In addition to that, I also wanted to mention the kind of new guidelines that we have published, and they're specifically focusing on anti-money laundering compliance officers. So they're a completely new set of guidelines. We were required to produce these type of guidelines within the supranational risk assessment that has been published by the European Commission. And what these guidelines do is they set out basically fit and proper requirements for AML compliance officers. Of course, these guidelines should be read very closely with our internal governance guidelines that are much wider in scope. But these AML compliance officer guidelines specifically focus on AML compliance role and how this role should be established in specific financial institutions. So the aim of these guidelines, I suppose, and something that will be helpful for internal audit functions as well, would be that it hopefully will strengthen the second line of defense, and obviously with that in mind, the systems and controls that will be implemented will hopefully be strengthened as well. And finally, I wanted to touch upon briefly on the risk-based supervision guidelines that have now been published, that are currently under public consultation, but the final version will be published shortly. This will be an amended version of the guidelines. So these guidelines are also originally published back in 2016. And what they do is they set out various steps that that supervisors need to take when implementing their AML CFT supervision on a risk-sensitive basis. So again, these guidelines, I suppose, have introduced a number or clarified a number of different steps where they now specifically include a requirement for competent authorities or AML supervisors to communicate and engage with the sector, and particularly there's now specific requirement to publish guidance for the sector where that is necessary. So again, with an aim to help the sector to implement risk-based approach effectively. Equally, it has now certain provisions about external auditors, external consultants that can potentially be used by the supervisors in their own work, and certain I suppose considerations that need to be applied when that is included in their supervisory practice. If we can move on to the next slide, please. And finally, in my presentation, I wanted to speak a little bit more about the very, very latest developments that are happening now within the AML CFT framework at an EU level. So you may know, or you may have heard, that on 20th of July, the European Commission has published a very ambitious proposal for a new legal and institutional AML CFT framework within the EU. The proposal is made up of 4 different pieces of legislation, and I will briefly touch upon each of them now in my presentation. I suppose the aim of this new legislative package was, first of all, to introduce kind of an EU single rulebook for AML CFT supervision and risk-based approach in general. I suppose the Commission is quite clear that a single rulebook does not mean one-size-fits-all approaches, and the risk-based approach is still very relevant, and of course the measures and controls that financial institutions put in place are still need to be put in place on a risk-sensitive basis. Secondly, the aim was to bring, I suppose, to consolidate the supervision of financial institutions in one EU AML supervisor. And in addition to that, there was, I suppose, the need for establishing a support and cooperation mechanism for FIUs. And I suppose these objectives are not new. They were set out in the Commission's action plan that was published on 7th of May back in 2020. And I suppose the action plan had a vision where that set out a reformed EU framework for AML CFT, and of course the Commission has now taken steps to implement this action plan in practice. So what do these 4 pieces of legislation mean for all of us? So I suppose the first and one of the most important changes that will be brought in is set out in the anti-money laundering regulation. So this regulation will be directly applicable to financial institutions. It sets out rules for financial institutions that they will need to implement in their own systems and controls framework. I suppose when looking at the regulation, it's nothing new. There are still requirements for customer due diligence to be carried out and for risk assessments to be carried out. I suppose the rules that previously were set out in the anti-money laundering directive and thereafter had to be transposed by national competent authorities are now consolidated in the regulation that will be directly applicable in all member states. And what that means is basically more consolidation, more common approach across the EU, which would of course be quite beneficial specifically for those institutions that operate on a cross-border basis. And I suppose from internal audit perspective, it will no doubt bring in quite a lot of quite a lot of challenges with making those changes necessary to systems and controls that will, of course, that might be different from the national approaches and now set out in the regulation. So it will be important to ensure that the necessary changes are implemented by financial institutions and that systems and controls are adjusted accordingly. Second, I suppose the biggest change will be the introduction of the new agency, the AMLA, as it's set out in the AMLA regulation. So as I mentioned earlier, the action plan was very clear that it required for a new AML CFT supervisor at an EU level to be established, and I suppose the AMLA regulation now does that. And you may wonder why it is necessary. I suppose the recent scandals and also the European Commission's own assessment of issues in their post-mortem report have set out divergences between different supervisors, how supervision is carried out across the EU and between different member states, and I suppose hence the decision to establish an EU wide AML CFT supervisor. So what will be the role of the supervisor? The powers and tasks will be very, very broad, as set out in the AMLA regulation. The supervisor will have direct and indirect supervisory powers over financial institutions. It will directly supervise a number of financial institutions. I suppose the largest groups that operate in Europe will be supervised by this new agency. The agency will have powers to impose sanctions or to take administrative measures. Equally, it will have indirect supervisory powers over a wide variety of financial institutions. So the agency will not look only after banks, but will look after the entire financial services sector. And I suppose the aim will be to ensure convergence of supervisory practices across the EU. In addition to that, the agency will also have indirect supervisory powers over non-financial services, and I suppose it will be interesting to see how it will play out in practice, but it will have quite wide powers in relation to non-financial sector. It will be able to carry out peer reviews or carry out certain investigations of potential breaches of union law and so on. And finally, I wanted to mention that the agency will also have powers to issue regulatory and technical standards. So it will be able to publish regulatory technical standards, guidelines, recommendations for the financial services sector, so for obliged entities, but equally for AML CFT supervisors and the FIUs. I suppose the plan at the moment is that the agency will have 250 staff and that it will be up and running, fully operational by 2026, when it will start direct supervision of institutions. So I suppose from the perspective of internal audit, it will probably change the engagement with the regulator, particularly for those internal auditors that are employed in institutions that will be under direct supervision of the new agency. It will potentially change the relationship between these auditors and the agents and the supervisor, because as I said earlier, the supervisory practices across the EU are currently quite different. So they will be probably more streamlined and more formalized with the establishment of the new agency. And I suppose, as it's set out in the AMLA regulation at the moment, that the agency will have direct general supervisory powers, where it will be empowered to request audit reports for review and review various databases and conduct interviews and conduct on-site inspections and so on. So very, very broad and wide powers. I suppose the legislation is still being negotiated, so we will see how it plays out at the end. And finally, I briefly wanted to mention also that the Anti-Money Laundering Directive has also been amended. I suppose the main changes will focus on AML CFT supervision. It will strengthen the provisions in relation to that, because obviously within the new framework, the national supervisors will have quite an important role to play as well. And it also strengthens certain provisions relating to the financial intelligence units. And finally, the fund transfer regulation is also amended, but the changes are, I suppose, limited only to the inclusion of the crypto asset service providers that are also now being brought within the framework of the fund transfer regulation. With that in mind, we can proceed to the next slide, please. With that in mind, I have come to an end to my presentation, and if you have interest in any of the EBA products or regulatory standards that I have spoken about, you can find those on our website, and I've included a link there. Equally, we do publish quarterly newsletters, so if you have interest in AML and CFT, you can sign up to the newsletter where we inform you of various different developments that come down from the EBA, but equally at an EU level. And with that in mind, I would like to thank you very much for your attention, and I am happy to take any questions if you have time left. Thank you.
Thank you very much, indeed. A really fascinating presentation. No shortage of developments in this key area, and I'm sure that if not already, a lot of the delegates out there attending today are furiously logging on to that website you put up and signing up for those newsletters. I'll be certainly making sure that I do that. Just as we're waiting for some questions to come in there, I wanted to get your perspectives on, how you see this risk, the AML risk, CFT risk, evolving. How has it evolved in the last few years? Are we seeing greater risk? It's always been high. Is it the same? Is it increasing? How's your perspective on that, India?
Thank you very much for a very good question. I can't say that it's decreasing or increasing. I suppose it changes all the time. So, and the previous presenter also spoke about changes that are being brought in by the fintech and equally by regtech providers now. And for that reason, we see significant changes, in the risks that are presented by all these newcomers to the market, but equally by these new and innovative solutions that are being used. In addition to that, obviously, the cryptocurrencies that are currently taken world by storm, they are presenting certain risks. But we are at EBA, we are continuously monitoring the changing landscape of money laundering, terrorist financing risks, and we are publishing a report every 2 years where we set out current risks within each sector, and equally where we focus on emerging risks that financial institutions should be aware of and should incorporate in their own risk assessments.
Yeah, absolutely. So again, all the more reason for us to link in with these sources of intelligence for us. Thank you. I've got some questions on the screen there. I will absolutely confess, unfortunately on my screen, they are very slightly cut off, but I hopefully can interpret the questions appropriately. So folks are interested, India, in your recommendations for the collaboration between internal audit, and I'm guessing that's probably supervision officers and oh, there we go. No, collaboration between AML officers and internal audit. Thank you very much for changing the screen.
Thank you. I suppose to some way the new AML compliance officer guidelines will address that question as well. But in terms of collaboration, I think it should be a very close collaboration between AML compliance officers and internal auditors. And just speaking from my own previous experience within the private sector, where we work very closely with internal auditors in terms of, I suppose, in terms of understanding, I suppose, all these type of changes that are coming down the line, and possibly giving heads up to the internal auditors what to expect and what to focus on in their own internal audit plans, which are generally set for a number of years ahead. So it would be helpful for that engagement to happen. Equally, I suppose for AML compliance officers to understand, where to have a second view as to where the weaknesses could potentially lie and potentially might need to be addressed from their own perspective. So I think the collaboration can be very beneficial for both sides.
Yeah, absolutely agree with that. And similar to yourself, I certainly would have seen the benefit of that in my career where I've worked in this field. It looks like there's understandably a bit of interest in terms of the new legislation, and you mentioned that that's obviously still being discussed and debated about how this will, the shape it will finally take. Is there any indication of when we might know more about the new supervisory body and therefore the impact of that new direct supervision for organisations?
So I need to check my notes for timelines. There have been indications from the Commission. So I suppose the plan is quite ambitious, I think, for the establishment of the new AML authority. But as highlighted by the Commission so far, is that the authority will be, I suppose, technically set up in 2024, fully staffed by 2025, and commence supervision from 2026. I suppose before starting the operations of the agency, they will be required to draft a large number of various regulatory technical standards and guidelines in order just to start functioning actually and carrying out supervision, because a lot of those regulatory instruments actually refer to the supervision and risk assessments and so on. So the plan so far is basically establishment 2024 and then full supervision starting from 2026. But of course, I think it's a revolving door at the moment.
Yes, it is. And I also think sometimes with future dates like that, there's always the risk of thinking, 2026 sounds a long time away, but it goes fast and there's a lot of preparation that you need to make sure that you're ready. So it's certainly one to be actively thinking about, I'd say.
Yes, and I suppose that the focus, on when looking at how the different legal instruments will be debated by the legislators, I suppose the plan, I think, is to start the discussions with the fund transfer regulation and also with the AMLA regulation, so that can be bedded down, and obviously then start working on the establishment of the agency.
Fantastic. Okay, do keep the questions coming in, guys. I see there is another one up there about collaboration, second and third line. I think we did cover that in the previous answer. Just whilst we're waiting for any more questions from the delegates there, I was interested, India, in your perspective from your career in compliance and AML, even before the EBA role, as to any tips or notes as to good practice for internal auditors, seeing as we've got a lot of them here, and or traps or not so good audit practices that you will have noted over your career?
I suppose the good practice, as I mentioned earlier, would be the collaboration and I think that's something that was mentioned by the previous speaker as well, that the engagement with the colleagues and by internal audit with colleagues and with different, I suppose, business areas to understand how they operate and understand the risks, and I think that is always very helpful as well when carrying out the internal audit thereafter, because I suppose a lot of issues might be able to address them before the report is finalized. In terms of bad practices, I don't think I can think of any.
That's always good to hear. As a virtual room full of auditors, it's good to know we're doing a good job. But there's always ways in which we can improve. And as I said at the start, I think there is a piece about just making sure focus remains on this topic, where there are many new challenges all the time in the ESG. We heard from Evelyn, but this will always be a core one to keep an eye on.
Yes, I suppose another good practice would probably be, for internal auditors to keep an eye out as to what is happening, and I know that the scope for internal auditors is very wide, and it's not just focused on AML, but in terms of AML, I suppose we have seen quite a lot of developments in recent years, and a lot of scandals, unfortunately, as well in recent years. So when putting in place the internal audit plan, those developments might have some impact on the areas that might need to be looked at as part of the internal audit as well.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. I did just have one other kind of area of interest that occurred to me as you were presenting, India, and that's you spoke about the evolution of typologies and how there is the sources that we can tap into as audit teams to keep an eye on that and filter that in. Has there been any differences noted during the pandemic? And any thoughts or reflections about how that risk landscape has shifted over the last 19, 20 months?
Yes, absolutely. I think we have seen a number of new typologies that have come to light as a result of the pandemic. We have published a statement on our website as well that kind of highlights the different risks that financial institutions might need to take a note of, in their own practice, but equally the supervisors that they might need to focus on as part of their supervisory practices. In terms of typologies, I suppose there has been quite a lot of publications highlighting these typologies that have come to light. Obviously our own publication, but then I think Financial Action Task Force has done some work on that as well. So to raise awareness and for financial institutions, it's of course quite important to take a note of these actions, because obviously these typologies have been developed in conjunction with financial intelligence units and law enforcement and so on that are directly exposed to some of these issues. I suppose what has come to light is, the abuse of various support systems that have been put in place by national governments, and obviously criminals have identified those as a good way of profit.
Yeah.
So they have often been abused for criminal purposes, and that's something that I suppose financial institutions need to take a note of and potentially adjust their own risk assessment, in that regard.
Yeah, no, that's a very, very good point. I see that I think we just have we do have a few more minutes left. There's another question that's appeared on the screen there. I wonder if we could just adjust the screen again, just so that I can make sure I can read the full question, if that's possible. I think I can see the thrust of it. Again, it's interesting in the developments of the new supervisory body. And how in the near future, what's the views on how this will work with national agencies on AML, and indeed the JST and SSM, and any views on how that might interact, notwithstanding, as you said, there's a lot still to be worked through on this.
Mm-hmm. I suppose the new regulation envisages quite a close relationship between the new agency and national competent authorities. As I mentioned earlier, that national competent authorities will continue to play quite an important role in the AML CFT supervisory framework. So while the new agency will have direct supervisory powers over a number of different financial institutions, it will exercise those powers in conjunction with national competent authorities. So I suppose that the legislator has recognized the importance of the local knowledge and local understanding of risks that might not be possible at a EU level. So the plan is to set up kind of similar to what they have at the European Central Bank, the kind of JST teams that will specifically then ensure that cooperation between national competent authorities and the new agency. In addition to that, the agency will also have certain role to in the supervision of those institutions that it will not directly supervise, so indirect supervision, and it will probably have quite close engagement with competent authorities to ensure convergence of supervisory practices, equally to ensure that convergence of risk assessment methodologies, for example, to ensure that supervision is working effectively across the EU and in relation to all financial institutions, and not just those supervised by the agency directly. I suppose in terms of the cooperation between the new agency and SSM, so the European Central Bank, it is extremely important. And as I said, at EBA, we have focused quite a lot on ensuring cooperation between prudential supervisors and AML supervisors and vice versa, because there are a lot of synergies and a lot of links between these two supervisory approaches, and I suppose that is something that is extremely important to be continued in the new setup of the institutions as well. So there are already some provisions in the new regulation, but I'm sure that those provisions will no doubt be strengthened in the final draft as well.
Fantastic, thank you. And maybe just to take this as the very last one in the last couple of minutes here, there's a question regarding, I think, global collaboration and how that works as well as across Europe.
I suppose in terms of global collaboration, the Financial Action Task Force, which is the global standard setter for AML CFT, plays quite an important role. Obviously, one of the pivotal roles and powers that the Financial Action Task Force is to carry out regular reviews and assessments of the countries around the world to ensure that they have implemented sufficiently adequate and effective AML CFT measures within their relevant jurisdictions. So anyone who has an interest can take a look at various assessments that have been carried out by the Financial Action Task Force. I think they're quite interesting to read. And I suppose what happens at the Financial Action Task Force then trickles down to the European framework, because obviously the standards that had been set out by the Financial Action Task Force are now incorporated in the Anti-Money Laundering Directive, and equally the new package that is being launched now by the European Commission. So in terms of global coordination, collaboration, I think probably more needs to happen, but particularly after seeing various publications of various leaks that have been published, with the latest one of Pandora, I think there needs to be greater collaboration between tax authorities and AML authorities across the world, and that's certainly something that we are promoting in Europe quite a lot. To ensure that AML supervisors cooperate with their respective tax authorities, but I think that cooperation needs to happen also globally. And I suppose the Financial Action Task Force that no doubt will take a look at that at some point. And as I said, they're already doing quite a lot in terms of ensuring global good standards in relation to AML CFT.
Wonderful, thank you so much. Well, indeed, it's been a really rich session. Thank you for your insights. I've certainly taken a huge amount, and I've been scribbling notes here, and I know everyone else will have done as well. So thank you for being so generous with your time and for fielding all the questions, and for enriching our day with a very important topic. Really appreciate it, indeed. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Bye.
Take care.